That way we get our recording going, and if everybody's ready, I'm ready to start. Ready?
Go.
All right, here we go. So I'm going to hit start webinar, and everybody should start in. We'll start seeing our participants joining in, so we'll give everybody a few moments to join into the space. And then we will start our program in just 1 second as we let all of our guests in. And welcome to our Lunch and Learn. And we will begin in just a moment. We want to make sure everyone has a chance to join in the space. So we'll give it just a second as everybody logs in. And hopefully everyone's having a wonderful start to this afternoon or morning, depending on where we are. And Margaret, I know you're in the happy morning mode. There we go. You and I, we're in that happy afternoon mode as well as Mike. All right. Well, Mike, I think we are going to go ahead and have you start us off. And Mike Friedman is our president of our local chapter of our Buffalo chapter, PRSA. Mike, take it away.
Thanks, Renee, and thanks everyone for being here today and sharing your lunch hour with us to participate in a discussion that is so important right now, you know, not only in public relations and communications, but across disciplines and around the world. You know, we're so grateful to be able to hold this event today, and thanks so much to Margaret and to Cedric for joining us. Really looking forward to a thoughtful discussion. Before we get started, however, I'd like to ask you to join me for a brief moment of silence in remembrance of Ron Smith, APR. Ron, who is a professor emeritus at Buffalo State College, was also a former Buffalo Niagara Chapter president and chair of PRSA's Northeast District, passed away Saturday. So I'd just like to take a moment for all of us to join in a moment of silence, please. Thank you. Well, there's certainly no great segue, but I do know that Ron was a major thought leader and author on how our profession should be more ethical and inclusive. And so I will turn it back over to Renee and to our esteemed panelists, who once again we're so grateful to have with us. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Mike, for that intro. And thank you everybody for being here, and really looking forward to just kind of chatting with each other. And I'd like, of course, to, as Mike mentioned, welcome you to the PRSA Buffalo Niagara Chapter Lunch and Learn conversation that's entitled, What If I Believe in and Want to? So today's format for our Lunch and Learn will be very conversational, organic, and just two-way with each of you, so that we can engage our esteemed panelists and their expertise and answer the questions as they arise. And at this point, I'd like to encourage you to use that Q&A feature generally found at the bottom of your tab there. Just put your questions into that posting, and we'll try to answer along the way. Hopefully, we'll be able to monitor them as we go along. As Mike mentioned, I'm your moderator, Rene Petties-Jones, and I am the Community Engagement Director and soon-to-be President and CEO of the National Federation for Just Communities here in Western New York, which is a human relations organization dedicated to elevating these very conversations. I also serve as the diversity chair for the Buffalo Niagara Chapter of PRSA, as well as secretary for the Northeast District PRSA. But more importantly, I'm here to introduce to you our guest panelists. Our first panelist that we have here is Cedric F. Brown, APR. Cedric is a digital strategist working to achieve racial equity through social impact relations. He is a regular contributor for those that read that PRSA Strategies and Tactics, which I'm a very big fan of. He writes in that newsletter where he covers diversity and inclusion topics. Margaret is Margaret Ritsch. Am I saying that correctly, Margaret? Margaret Ritsch, EDD, APR, fellow PRSA, is an award-winning accredited public relations professional with more than 25 years experience helping with business and nonprofits, enhancing their visibility and reputations, and strengthening important relationships. So, to begin our conversation, I wanted to talk about why I set out to find these panelists and what was my motivation. It began really with Margaret's blog, which we'll talk about a little later on, where she talked about the blurred lines between ethics and activism. And that got me wondering, what do you do when you want to become more active in something that may or may not align with the organization or the company that you work for? And after hearing and reading many of Cedric's articles in our PRSA publications, I felt it important to bring his perspective to this dialogue and this conversation, as he often talks about issues surrounding diversity and inclusion, which is where we kind of find ourselves really colliding with that activism at this time. So to start us off, I thought it would be nice to answer the question myself that we're posing here. What if you want to become involved? And for me personally, it's an easy answer simply because where I work lines completely with my activism. Being out on the front lines doesn't conflict. So again, I ask that question, what would happen if it did? Would I even be working for those organizations in those places? So before we go into that kind of deeper dive conversation, I'd like to turn it over to have our panelists just explain a little bit about their background, their history, and give us a little of their perspective. So first off, let me toss it to Cedric. I'm going to give it to you. And if you don't mind sharing a little bit about your background.
Yeah, no problem, Renee. Hey, everybody. Cedric here. The reason why I was brought on to this panel, not just because of my recent diversity and equity and inclusion efforts, but for a brief moment, I was working at Advancement Project National Office as the digital campaign strategist. What that entailed for me was not only doing our organization's social media and digital media strategy, but I would also have to consult with our different grassroots partners on some of the efforts and campaigns that they were doing. Before that, I have a very varied background, work experience. I really got my start where I'm from in Detroit, Michigan, where I had like 4 different full-time jobs and just marketing different industries. But really on the side of that, I was volunteering my services as a freelance consultant. And most of the organizations that I was freelancing for were youth serving community groups, again, in Detroit, Michigan. And so I'm balancing this volunteer work while working full time. And it came with some interesting challenges. Ultimately, I really determined that I enjoyed the work that I was doing as a freelancer that was closer to PR. I'm basically just writing press releases and doing a little bit of social media management. I enjoyed that work more than the stuff that I was doing full time. And it really shone through in the way that I brought myself to work in those different positions. So ultimately, I decided to pursue a master's degree at Syracuse University. And I networked my way into Washington, D.C., which is currently where I'm at now and where I have been for about 4 years. And, before Advancement Project, I got my start in D.C. working for a racial justice PR firm boutique for 3 months. I was doing a lot of media relations around a report that focused on how the loss of manufacturing jobs impacted Black communities. And then from there, I went on to a firm called Hager Sharp, where I worked on a lot of education and health related issues. The firm fancies themselves as a social impact firm. So some of the government agencies that we were working on really had the intention of leading healthier and more and smarter lives. And then that brought me to Advancement Project for a bit. And so currently what I'm up to right now is just searching for different digital strategy opportunities to really get back into the space and use this opportunity and utilize my skills to build racial equity.
Wow. Very, very interesting background. And certainly I can't wait to ask you some more specifics about your experience there in DC, because obviously that's a very interesting space to be in at this point, because it's the hub, it seems, of a lot of activism going on there. So thank you, Cedric, for that background. I appreciate that. And Margaret, I might ask you the same thing, if you don't mind sharing maybe a little bit more about your expertise and background with some of our listeners here.
Sure. And I have to say, I envy you, Cedric, because you're a lot younger than me, and you've had the opportunity to work for social impact agencies. It seems to me there's been more of a blossoming of that industry over the last few years. And, probably a lot of us just haven't had those kinds of opportunities and have been stuck in other types of opportunities where we kind of hit some roadblocks in terms of the very thing that we're going to be talking about today. I recently actually began teaching at Washington State University. I'm here in Idaho today. I spent most of my career working for nonprofits, for a governmental agency recently, but also a couple of ad PR agencies. And that's where I ran into some issues, being asked to do a couple of projects, that I really believed were unethical. So that's my professional life. Getting into activism, I've been involved in activism also for about 4 years, most recently, with Black Lives Matter in Fort Worth and Dallas. And so, what I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about today, is wearing both hats, being a public relations professional, but also an activist, and thinking about how, kind of like in the course of my career anyway, how I kind of felt like I had to hide my beliefs and my values from my employer. How many of us feel that we can't say that we're activists. We got to keep that under wraps because we don't want our clients or our employers to think ill of us or to be offended, or we don't want to jeopardize our jobs. So I've had time to really think about these things. I've had time to think about, I've just been watching Black Lives Matter and political movements and other social activist movements. And I've been looking at all the strategies and the tactics that they're doing, which are really PR and strategic communication, but these activists don't call it that, right? And there's thousands of activists out there that belong in our profession. They're doing our work. And then I started thinking about also, and our profession is too white, we need more diversity within the profession. And I just felt like there's so much of a disconnect. I'll say one other thing and then turn it back over to you. I've had time, as an academic, to do a lot of reading and thinking about PR and how we're still in this kind of corporate model where we talk about we're managers for our organizations. Typically we view activist groups as kind of like these issues out there. Oh dear, these activists, we have to kind of manage them. We have to manage this relationship. So anyway, that's kind of where my head has been, and where I'm still working through some things, and really just appreciate the opportunity today to talk about it and to see what other people are thinking about and what questions that this conversation raises.
I think you're so spot on, Margaret, because I think a lot of these conversations bring up a lot of internal conflicts that we may be experiencing and wondering, and I'm sure we're not alone in having these questions. And, as we get closer and closer to not only the holidays, but the big political divide that we're facing, this is going to be the forefront of these dialogues. And how do we reconcile our personal beliefs and our personal feelings with what we are doing and still keep the integrity of public relations at the forefront? And of course, not losing that. And that leads me to this next question that I'd like to pose to both of you. And what happens, or what do you feel happens, when your personal values conflict with those of the organizations that you represent or that you work for? And do you have any personal examples that maybe you can share with us as to how you might have handled it or reconciled it? Or what do you each of you feel about that situation?
Cedric, do you want to go first on that one? Yeah.
Sure. So at Advancement Project, that organization believes in the mission of abolition. They don't want to reform prisons. They want to get rid of them altogether. The belief is that instead of investing in mass incarceration in prisons, which are really just an advanced form of slavery, to be honest, they want our nation and our world to really focus more on rehabilitation. So they're a big part of the defund the police movement. Before I started at Advancement Project a few years ago, I'd lost a loved one to violence in a case that's honestly still being ongoing underneath a federal investigation. To be able to feel a little bit of that hurt and like justice hasn't really been achieved for my family. It was interesting to come into this organization that believes that, no, we don't need prisons at all. How I ended up navigating it is just really learning about what the philosophy of abolition really meant. And for me, it was being able to understand it and communicate on behalf of it for social media and digital media purposes, and to buy into it. And it made me also see my family tragedy kind of in a different way. I won't say whether or not that I now believe in abolition, but I understand the argument. And I think that's kind of what we need to be able to do as a society. We've really gotten away from being willing to understand opposing viewpoints or a new viewpoint that challenges what we know.
That's a great point.
Yeah, I was thankful to be able to have the opportunity to understand what abolition really meant and support an organization that believes that it can really happen.
Well, I think what you brought out there is so important about just researching and understanding the history and the educational component. I mean, we're all students all the time. I mean, there's never one of us that can say we know everything about everything all the time. So having that sense of urgency to research and understand different perspectives through the educational component may actually help in reconciling some of these disconnects that maybe we're feeling. Thanks for sharing, Cedric. Margaret, what are your thoughts about that? How do you, and have you had specific examples of having to reconcile that potential disconnect there?
Yeah, I think for me, it's really been, some of those situations have been in an agency environment. And I mean, I think that, a lot of agencies, mid-size agencies, you just take the business that comes in the door, and so there's a lot of financial pressure on agencies. It's competitive, to just, whatever, serve a range of clients. Not every agency can be a social impact kind of agency, So I've been, I'm trying to be careful about this because you have to, protect confidences, and that's, I'm trying to be ethical when I talk about, but I'll just say this, that I did some work for a client in the energy business, in the energy industry. And one of the things that I dealt with was a client that really, we had great, robust conversations publicly and in all the materials that we did and all the outreach that we did, press outreach and all that content creation that had to do with the positive economic impact of a certain sector in the energy industry. But there were some definite environmental damage that could really happen and that was happening. But, I was kind of in a situation where I couldn't be dealing with any of that and couldn't listen to any of those stakeholders, do any kind of accommodation. You want to talk about the two-way symmetrical model that I know is, it's kind of like the vaunted model. And what we do as a profession is that we need to be listening as much as we need to be talking. Couldn't do any listening, and couldn't get really the backing of the agency either. So, I mean, when it comes down to, and I don't really want to talk about the aftermath of it because it's just, it's not really, it's tough. And I basically, what I decided was, I think that what I decided was really important for me, and that was going to be really important for me to talk about with young people, with students I work with, is that, look, it's so important to know yourself, to know your values, to know your line in the sand, and to find a culture fit, to go ask good questions when you're going for an interview. You go work for an agency and for an organization that you believe in, that whose values agree with yours. Because if you don't do that, if you're not careful, you find yourself in these fixes, and there aren't any easy answers. There just aren't. You just may end up losing your job, or you may end up walking away, and you may end up unemployed for a while, but you really just have to find that fit. So my last job out in industry was with a large housing authority in Fort Worth, where we were, working directly and lifting up stories of people that really need housing assistance, largely, really high poverty populations. And I loved it, and I felt like I was fine. I kind of had found my home. Anyway, that's sorry for probably talking too much here, but
No, not at
that's
all.
the kind of thing that I run. Yeah.
No, I think that's, and you got me to thinking about maybe just the opposite effect. And you brought up something there, Margaret, and I'd be curious to know how each of us might respond. But what if, our organizations or businesses or industries that we're in, what if they asked us to place a statement out there that completely went opposite of what we believe? What would we do? Would you feel comfortable exposing something that doesn't necessarily line up with what you believe in and what the current trend is for you? And of course, that brings up that opposite caveat, because, we can talk about that a little later, but my question always comes back to, can we talk about some of these current things that are going on in our country, like racism and issues surrounding Black Lives Matter that are extremely important, without becoming political? Every single time it seems like we step into these forays of these conversations, the political hats come out. And are we blurring these lines again? And, are we taking positions when we're really just trying to expose the truth and the matter? And so it kind of goes in tandem. And Cedric, I'd be curious to see, would you have been comfortable putting out a statement that would have been completely a 180 to what you felt and believed in?
Well, luckily, I've never been in a situation in a work environment where I had to do something of that sort. I'm very careful, especially these days, to research the types of organizations out there and what they really do for the communities at large. For instance, there's a social impact organization out there that brands themselves as being community oriented and getting involved and wanting to achieve racial justice, but their founders are the Koch brothers. Understand the history of the Koch brothers, you'll understand that there's no amount of philanthropy that they could do that would ever convince you that that's an organization that's really genuine and that you would want to work for. So I think that's kind of what we all have to do, is be willing to do the homework on organizations that we potentially work for. You have to draw a line in the sand on things that are really non-negotiables. For many Black people, racism is a non-negotiable.
Yeah, I think you're right on that one. And certainly as I'm looking at some of these comments that we've got coming into our feature, and we'll definitely need to take a look at this. And Margaret, while we're looking at some of these questions that are popping up here, tell me what your thoughts on that. I mean, if somebody were to have said to you when you were in Fort Worth to have to do something that was completely opposite, or maybe smoothing over what was right in the face of the truth, what would you have done?
Yeah. Well, I mean, my approach would be, as with so much other work that we need to do in PR, is to start with the research and say, this is what this public or these stakeholders or our local community, this is what's going on out there. This is what the research shows there's public support for, or whatever. I'll just say that on issues of racial injustice and equity, I mean, you can just look at the most recent Edelman Trust Barometer report on racial justice and equity and see that significant majority of the public, and they've done some really good, this is solid research, really expects that brands and companies are going to be taking a stand on racial injustice, inequities, really taking a stand. And not just that, don't make it just lip service, but get your house in order on hiring and promotion and recruitment and a whole host of other internal issues. So, I mean, just presenting your clients or your employers with that kind of research to say, hey, this is what's going on out in the culture. And if we want to be relevant as an organization, if we want to be listening to our stakeholders, we need to be engaged in these kinds of conversations. I will say this, I'll finish with this. It requires an enormous amount of courage to be a leader in our profession, because often in PR, we are right out there on dealing with these issues, and trying to be the moral compass in our organization. And it is tough. It is not for the faint of heart. We all have to just pray and just have as much courage as we possibly can to try to lead these conversations and to be leaders within our organizations.
Exactly. I think you just said a mouthful there, Margaret, about being brave and just taking on what we believe and what we know to be right and standing up for that very right thing. Oftentimes I think that we feel that we have to almost be silenced every now and again when something gets tough that we put out there that, we know better, but we have to be that leader in that organization to say, yeah, hang on, that messaging isn't on point with this. And here's why. Particularly when you find that your diversity is not in the room when the creatives are coming in or when your stakeholders are a part of it, they have no idea. So oftentimes I think you find yourself being the one and only saying, hang on a second, that didn't kind of ring quite true. And, I'm finding myself currently into that situation where there is a name of something that completely goes against the pale of what I know to be correct. And having to stand up and be that one person to say, wait one second. You feel like you're on an island by yourself, and having enough support and understanding that that moral compass is what drives you is most important. But when you talked about some of those stats, Margaret, one of the things that I recently read, and I'm going to quote some of this, is it's a recent study that said 78% of consumers in the United States want brands to address social justice issues. I mean, that's a lot, 78%. They go further to say that 87% said that they would purchase products from companies that advocated for a cause of issues that were important to them. 76% also said that they would not patronize a company that supported issues that didn't align with them. So if you're looking at just those stats alone, activism, social activism is speaking loudly now. And I think we as PR professionals have to be ready to pivot, listen, and be able to pivot. So again, it's very interesting, the approach that you guys are both mentioning here. And perhaps maybe, Margaret, I know you have some slides that you can share with us. It would be a wonderful thing if you can kind of walk us through that. And then we will start to take in some of these questions here. But I'd like to see your slide presentation.
Yeah, I'll go through this pretty quickly because we've already covered some of the ground. Just from what you're talking about too, can everybody see the screen?
I'm getting it on my side, so hopefully we're in good shape there.
Yeah. PR, let me close this off so I can see myself. Yeah, just as you're saying, Rene, the world's changing at warp speed. We've got to step up our game. Honestly, the marketing and advertising industry is doing this kind of thing, because in the ad industry, when you're doing good work there, you're listening to the culture and reflecting the culture. And so PR is a little bit behind the times in that way. So we need to adapt and lead important conversations on these issues. Let's see, hold on. I think that it's important to, go back to our roots. PR has a deep history of activism. I mean, all of these critically important movements in the 19th century were really public relations movements. And really, it wasn't, I think basically sort of in the early 19th century, or rather 20th century, late 19th century, corporations began to see some of the tactics and the strategies that these workers' movements and other movements were doing very successfully, and said, hey, we can begin to hire people in our corporations to really use these same strategies and tactics to build the reputation of our company. So in other words, I think we really started out as a profession, in large part, in activism. So I think it's helpful for us to go back to our history and kind of reclaim that. But wait, again, in these days in public relations and the way we define it, activist groups and their demands are seen almost like as the enemy often in conversations on the corporate level. They've got to be managed. That's why this whole field of issues management got started. But I wanted just to let everybody know today that out in the research field and in scholarship land, there's some really exciting new thinking about public relations and its role and what it can do. Marina Vujovnic talks about how organizations and their leaders should demonstrate concern not just for their quote unquote strategic publics, but inclusively with all others in the social system of which this organization is a part. That's kind of abstract, but let me get to the next slide and maybe it'll make it a little clearer. Dean Kruckerberg, who's written co-authored some of the big textbooks that may be used in college to study public relations, he's thinking about how greater attention should be paid to stakeholders with very little power, and such as marginalized communities, as well as animals and even the physical environment, due to the critical issue of climate change and so forth. So there are new ways of thinking about what we do in PR. I referred to the Edelman Trust Barometer report a little while ago, again thinking about where the country is headed. Companies and brands are seen as having a moral obligation to speak out against systemic racism and racial injustice, and they owe it to their employees. Brands that are seen as doing well in addressing racial issues are 3 times more likely to be trusted. This is good research. This is a survey of 2,000 adults, nationally representative sample along the lines of gender and race and ethnicity. So it comes down to, again, what's your line in the stand? What are your values? To think about our code of ethics. I've always thought that the loyalty principle in that code, to me, has always been the most kind of difficult area, because you got to be faithful to who you represent, but you also have to honor our obligation to serve the public interest. And honestly, you can see within that statement that there's tension there. And my personal belief is that if you've got to err, because there's going to be tension at some point or another between the two, I would rather err on the side of the public good, because after all, I got to live with myself. I got to look at myself in the mirror. I guess my feeling is sometimes if you do fear losing your job, if you have to stand up, if you feel like you want to try to serve the public interest and you can't convince anybody and you're just worried about losing your job, that really maybe you're not in the right organization. So last slide here is just take courage, lean in, grab a seat at the table, and be really ready and know that our role is to really either lead or convene or facilitate some really important conversations right now. So that is what I've got.
That's important. And, I had someone recently say something to me that kind of stuck with me, that we've got to create more spaces where we have seats at the table, because if you don't have a seat at the table, you're on the menu. And as soon as she said it to me, I'm like, whoa, okay, you're speaking the truth right now. So one of our statements that I'm noticing here is, how can allies be convinced to be mentors to and supporters of people of color in work environments? And, that's a very big, broad question. Any thoughts from either of you on that one?
Yeah. I'm sorry, you can go ahead, Margaret.
No, go ahead, Cedric. Go ahead.
Yeah, so, yeah, I've written about this in September. For people that really want to be allies, you have a lot of work to do to really learn about our history of racial injustice. One of the common mistakes is people or our white allies looking to get out in front or even declaring themselves allies. But honestly, allyship isn't declared, it's earned. And you have to put in the work to really deserve that trust of Black and brown people. And the way you build that trust is being willing to listen without getting defensive over your whiteness, being willing to not lead the efforts and letting people of color take the lead on the issues that most affect them. And just being there to support them and just listening. Those are really the big things that allies need to be able to do. And if you're looking to be a mentor to somebody that is younger to you or within the profession, it's kind of the same thing. You need to be able to listen to some of the things that they have going on and be willing to step up when they're having significant issues. You would have the power just based on your whiteness, to be honest, to correct another person that might be committing a racial injustice or treating them passive aggressively. So that balance is really the key to allyship.
Huge piece. Margaret, your thoughts on that?
I think Cedric, he said it so well. And, it's, yeah, you do run into defensiveness. And I mean, I know that I've experienced it, and I know that I have a lot to learn. I think getting people on board, I think, again, in PR, if we can play that role as listeners and model listening, and I don't know, you need to bring in a consultant. There are wonderful people out there who work for organizations. I know quite a number of myself, actually, of consultants who can come in and get groups together and do dialogues, interracial dialogues. We did a whole thing in Texas, actually, sort of a racial and cultural series of courageous conversations all over the city, and they were run very expertly. And so, maybe your organization needs that kind of help, because, I mean, this is not easy, and this is not probably like water cooler conversation, and we all get in our little silos doing our work, and then all these tensions build up. So I kind of feel like I'm kind of an advocate for bringing in consultants, having a real systematic approach to this, because white people need to listen, and sometimes they don't know how to, and sometimes you have to have like a forced socially engineered
a conversation with people to just kind of say, ooh. And I think that's one of the things that our organization does here locally, is that we try to get in front of, people to say, hey, let's talk about some of these things and the terminology that we use and the imagery that we use. We need to really be very careful. We're always learning new phrases, catchphrases that have just been so baked into what we write and how we present things out into the community, that have undertones that clearly, if you have the folks at the table, they could say, hey, wait, that didn't sound so cool. That may not be the language that you want to use in this press release. Oftentimes people pejoratively use the word, hooligans, say, for example. I mean, how pejorative is that term? And if you don't have someone to give you that gut check to say, hey, why are you using that word? Or what is it that you mean when you say areas that are poor areas of color that, are disenfranchised and, not part of the plan, and, all the code speak that gets baked into the words and the language that we use moving forward. How do we make sure we check ourselves on that? And, Cedric, I think you kind of touched on that as well, to make sure that we're clear in our language as moving forward. Now, I'm noticing another question here that, I'd like to take now before we go a little further, but it says, what about the Black Lives Matter statements on behalf of an organization? How can you effectively influence a stronger statement? Any thoughts on that, either of you?
I mean, I'm just wondering I think that's a great question. And I guess I'm gonna raise I'm wondering if it would be helpful. I mean, if PRSA or could be kind of like a clearinghouse, and if somebody could be collecting statements that organizations are making all over the country and just kind of have them there as kind of like a menu, not a menu, but you know what I mean? I mean, to just kind of show what others are doing, and then, put some of those before your employer and get them to think about, well, this is what Chevron is saying, and this is what ExxonMobil is saying, like some of the big run, this is what Amazon is saying, kind of like sexy companies, what they're, and, play that card a little bit.
Yeah.
What do you think, Cedric?
So I recently drafted a statement for an organization about racial injustice and Black Lives Matter. My approach, and the approach that I would recommend to any organization, is you can't really know where you're going if you don't really acknowledge where you've been. I worked at an organization that was solely focused on looking at what they had currently and celebrating the fact that they, on the surface, had a diverse workforce, but they were having internal issues among the Black and Hispanic employees, feeling how they've been treated by upper management. So it really, ultimately, the external actions that our organization wanted to take rang hollow because we were treating the people inside very well. When I thought about the statement that I wrote and how I corrected it from the first draft, was admitting that this is for a health organization, that the health industry in our nation has a historic practice of discriminating against Black and marginalized communities. Being able to recognize that and say, well, we can't change the past, but we are dedicated to making sure that you have a better future, and only then will you be willing to trust us. That can go a long way. Can't just say what's going on presently without acknowledging what's happened in the past. Because, a lot of things happened after slavery. So, just being mindful of that.
Oh, I think that's a huge piece there, Cedric, because if you don't have the historical background, how do you know that it's wrong to say, or that that's the wrong direction to go down if you haven't done your research? So again, education, I think, seems to be a very critical piece to this conversation. And, again, I'm looking at this next question that we see here in the chat. From a PR and communications perspective, do you have any advice for challenging leadership that is reluctant to look at their flaws or holes in social justice and racial equity, rather? And I think that's a huge question, because how do you challenge leadership, and what tool do we have in our tool chest that as PR professionals we can utilize? Margaret, what are your thoughts on that?
Research. An internal survey of employees. Where are employees right now in our culture? What are they thinking about the organization itself, and any issues that they see around race and culture? What are the employees telling us, and then bringing that back to the leadership. If the the good leadership understands how critically important employees are, and that they're your number one stakeholder, because employees are going to be out in the community, and if they're saying bad things about you or talking about how Cedric, how well they've got this great reputation externally, but do you know what's really happening on the ground? So doing your research and presenting what the data shows to your leadership, hopefully can move them in the right direction.
Good ideas. Cedric, what are your thoughts on that? Anything additional to that?
That's a very tough question, because I was at an organization where, despite them paying for a diversity and inclusion consultant, we're still unwilling to change some of the microaggressions, such as not saying hello to the Black people on your finance team when you walk by them in the morning. It's got to be money to pay for a diversity consultant when you're not willing to take some of the small steps. I feel like this is kind of where people have to be able to draw a line in the sand. You give them enough grace or enough time to try and show them the error of some of their ways and how some of the things that they're doing are offensive. But ultimately, they have to make the decision on their own to want to change their ways. And if the leadership isn't doing it from a genuine place of interest, truthfully, you might have to decide if that's an organization that you want to be a part of. And if not, then you move on. Or even the board can get involved and decide, and they see the results and how it's impacting their workplace. They can involve and say, all right, you need to make these course corrections.
I think that microaggressions that you brought up there is a huge component. A lot of people are not aware of how subtle some of those microaggressions can be and how dismissive they can be. And even having a DEI professional inside an organization, if you don't give them the power to be able to make the change, if you're just giving them the title to check off the box, then you're leaving them powerless to be effective. And I think a lot of folks get caught in that trap of saying, hey, send it over to our D&I person, they'll handle it. But then they give them no teeth and no legs to be able to really respond to the issues at hand. So I think that's important that we check those microaggressions and make sure that the leadership structure is effective as we've got them. Now, we also have another question here that I'd like to jump on, and please feel free to put any of your questions in this chat feature, and we'll try to get to them if we have time. It says, as a low-level PR person in an institution that prides itself on serving marginalized populations, how do you code check and sensitivity check yourself when writing about those programs and populations when no one in leadership is a person of color? And that could be a problem in and of itself, as they mentioned, without putting the burden on another person of color. And I know, Cedric, you kind of touched on that about how being alone and having that burden. So, maybe I'll toss that to you your way, and then we'll see what Margaret has to say on that.
Yeah, that's a pretty heavy burden to be the only one in an organization, because if you're not careful, you'll feel like your leadership is looking for you to be like the be all and end all of if they embrace diversity and inclusion a bit more. So I think what this person is talking about is like the liberal form of racism. We have the conservative view, which is like, you guys just need to stop being irresponsible and stop relying on the government to bail you out. But there's the other side of racism is like, oh, wow, these people are so helpless. They should be happy to have our help, and we got to lead them. So in situations like that, you have to take the lead to share with them some of that inclusive language. And again, be courageous in showing them that why what they're talking about is wrong. You shouldn't be looking at marginalized communities as charity cases. It should be a partnership to where you want to empower them to be able to take back and achieve restorative justice in their own spaces. And that's going to start with telling leadership and giving leadership the resources to understand how they're communicating with communities of color and just marginalized communities in general.
Because I think you're right, Margaret. I think you kind of touched on that in the beginning about our profession not being nearly as diverse as what it needs to be. I mean, we definitely need to increase the diversity, increase the representation from top down as much as possible, because that will help avoid some of these microaggressions. But in response to that question that we just mentioned, what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, I think if make sure I understand the question. I mean, again, I think if you're kind of operating solo or feeling alone and you're carrying this burden as a low-level PR person, I mean, I think if that person can't tell if that person is a white person or a person of color who's in this PR role. I mean, I think that, if white in that role, just educating yourself as much as possible, getting on Twitter, listening to Sean King. I mean, just being a listener yourself to understand the issues and the language and, the code or whatever, can maybe sensitize you to doing the kind of writing that's culturally sensitive. I don't really know other than that. And I think, then obviously trying to put yourself in the position if you can of who, if I'm this person in a marginalized community or whatever, or Black employee, and I'm reading this, what's my reaction or my response going to be? Trying to, be as if you're the listener or the receiver of your information or your communication. But I think what it comes down to primarily is about educating ourselves and doing a lot more listening than talking.
Yeah, I think that's a key right there, is a lot of listening, and unfortunately it never ends. Go ahead, Cedric, go ahead.
Caveat, Sean King is problematic.
So, okay.
Yeah, I mean, some of his reporting is fine, but you do some research on Sean King, he might not be the best voice to always listen to. There are tons of others out there that are more credible and don't have very problematic histories. So again, you go back and do the research on the people who you want to support and who you want to listen to.
Good point. That's interesting.
Okay.
Now, and here is another question that's in the feature too. In a previous job, 2 higher-ups asked me to create a customer survey. They laughed at me for putting other as a choice of gender and laughed at the general notion of anything other than man and woman. I felt ridiculed and powerless to do anything there, since there would be retaliation had I reported it to HR. I let it go, thinking about the phrase "pick the battles," as we just kind of talked about. This was 8 years ago, but the moment still sticks and still irks me. What could I do differently if faced with a similar situation in the future? And I guess you can almost insert any kind of situation going on right now into that scenario. What are your thoughts? Margaret, maybe we'll start with you. And Cedric, what are your thoughts?
I hate to beat a dead horse, but again, it's research. It's your customers. How many people out there identify as non-binary, in your customer base? It's in Gen Z and millennials, that's a growing number. That's a growing number of people. We can't ignore that. So presenting the data.
Good point.
Objectively.
Objectively, yes.
You can keep feelings out of that. You don't have to get all upset about it, but just showing the data and showing the numbers. Mm-hmm. They speak for themselves.
Mm-hmm. Especially the trends. Cedric, what are your thoughts on that?
Similar to what Margaret is saying, you show them examples of surveys that are starting to include this more gender diversity on some of their surveys. Mm-hmm. I don't know what type of financial position that you were in at that point, but yeah, you pick and choose your battles. But if this was something that was super passionate to you about, I wonder if it's not worth, or if it's worth taking that risk to put your neck out on the line. There's certain things that just shouldn't be tolerated, no matter how much evidence or how much convincing you have to be able to do. And this is another key point that people need to be able to understand is you never want to deny somebody's experience. So if I go to work and I tell my supervisor that, hey, something you said to me was offensive, and they say, oh, that's not true. I didn't mean it that way. That's wrong. That's the incorrect answer. Your response should always be, I'm very sorry. Tell me more about how that was offensive and help me to understand the error of my ways so that we can have a more improved relationship.
Wow. I think you just said a mouthful on that one. That's a huge thing for anybody who's really facing that situation. And I think we all do at some point or another. You know, and we're rounding down into the end of our time here, but I have one more question in our chat, and then I want to bring out some resources here. Yeah, I've taught PR at the college level for more than 25 years, and I'll bet I haven't had 25 students of color. How can organizations such as PRSA or university interest people of color in the profession? And that is huge. How do we bring more into the fold? Any thoughts? I mean, I know, you know, what we have here, obviously, you know, we've had these conversations, but what are you thinking? How can we encourage more people that are diverse people into our profession and not make them feel that they're coming from the outside looking in, that they are welcomed and a part of the process in the profession?
Ultimately, what you can't see. So what I commend PRSA and PR Week and other PR bodies around the world for doing is showcasing the expertise of professionals of color of all different sexual orientations and genders, to show how you can come from any background and be successful in this profession. You know, for the first time in PR Week's history, a Black person tops its power list. So being able to show people that want to enter the profession what you can possibly be, just with the right amount of time and talent and connections.
Mm-hmm. Right. I think that is a huge thing about the connections. Margaret, any thoughts on that one? How we can get a more diverse pipeline going here, if anything?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I think that Cedric can speak much better probably to that than me. I know that, you know, maybe some of us are teaching, you know, in higher ed. This person asked the question is in higher ed. I mean, there may be other academic programs that attract more people of color at your institution. I don't know what those academic areas would be, but, you know, public relations department or strategic communication can be doing like holding panel discussions or something on a topic that's going to interest, you know, students who are inclined to education or a different kind of major to kind of lure them over. I mean, there's so many different things we need to be doing. I mean, we need to be our local PRSA chapters going into high schools, you know, going into local public high schools, talking up what we do. I mean, you know, we talked a lot about that in the Fort Worth chapter of PRSA. We haven't gotten started on that yet, but I think that's also really important, is to plant that seed early. I'd love to see PRSA take on that as a big project somehow and get that organized. Because I think you do have to get people thinking about that earlier on. And so earlier when we talked about activism, all these people out on the streets who are doing PR strategies and tactics, I don't know if that's also maybe an opportunity to begin to talk to people. Are these folks at a community college? Are they at a university? Did they not go to college? Are they interested in doing this, not just in activism, but for an organization or an agency? I don't know if there's a way to maybe bridge that a little bit.
That's an interesting approach, because you're right. I mean, they're on the front lines. They've got opinions that they're exposing, and they're doing it in various ways that are new and innovative, and why not? You know, as we round down our time, I know we want to be very respectful. I want to draw the attention to our viewers to check out some of your articles, your blogs. We didn't get a chance to get to them because we've had such a robust conversation today, but I know, Cedric, you wrote an article, Finding Common Ground, that I enjoyed, and Steps Towards Allyship. You've got a lot of resources out there. And Margaret, of course, the blog that I referenced that brought us to this conversation is Thoughts on Balancing Your Professional Work and Your Activism. And for those that are members of PRSA, and even those that aren't, I believe you can search on the PRSA website to look for any of these resources. But in the process, could you also put in the chat if either of you have a way for people to be able to reach out and continue this dialogue? Because part of what I feel that we need to do as a profession is start to connect the dots across the country, across these divides, across some of these ways that people can reach back and say, hey, you know, I didn't think about this, but could you ask this and tell us more about that? I'd love for you to do that. And I know that, Mike, if you're in the space here, we'd love to just thank our folks here. And Mike, here you are. Hey, just like that, cyberspace, we're in. I just want to, again, thank our panelists for being here. And Mike, I want you to close us out, but thanks for taking the time to talk to me. I think I've learned a lot every time I do. Thanks so much.
Couldn't agree more, Renee.
Yes.
And really, I'll just reiterate our chapter's gratitude to Margaret and Cedric for providing us with such great insight. And really, the most important part, I think, is the actionable approaches to, helping shift the tide for our businesses and our world to be more inclusive. I was really inspired to see such an active discussion today, between panelists and also with attendees. And I think that really speaks to the importance and the timeliness of the topic that we were focused on. Big thank you as well to Renee for coordinating and hosting this session. Her work and the work of her committee on behalf of the Buffalo Niagara Chapter has been nothing short of exemplary. So thank you, Renee.
Absolutely.
And then finally, just also want to thank everyone who attended today's session, from across the PRSA landscape. I think that your attendance today really illustrates your interest in making some significant and meaningful change happen. So with that being said, I would just, encourage us to let's march onward together and really make the change happen that we talked about today. So thanks, everyone. We really appreciate your time and insight, and we look forward to seeing you soon.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great afternoon, everyone. Take care now. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.